A strange sensation wakes you up at 3 in the morning. It starts at the sole of your foot. A buzzing, a pins and needles crawl that moves up the ankle, sometimes reaching the calf. You shake your leg, you get up and walk around. Maybe it fades, maybe it does not. You tell yourself it is nothing. A weird sleeping position, poor circulation from sitting too long, and then it happens again the next night, and the night after that. I have reviewed clinical data on this pattern for years, and the one thing that strikes me more than anything else is not the symptom itself. It is the gap between when most people first feel that tingling and when they finally find out what it actually means. On average, that gap is somewhere between 3 and 7 years. 3 to 7 years of a body that is sending clear, urgent distress signals, and a medical system that hands out the same rehearsed answers. Neuropathy, vitamin deficiency, circulation issue, take this supplement, come back in 6 months. The real conversation, the one about what is actually happening inside the arterial wall, rarely happens until something catastrophic forces it. Today that conversation happens here. What I'm about to walk you through is the biological chain of events that connects that tingling in your foot to a process that has been silently narrowing your arteries, possibly for decades. I will explain what mainstream guidance gets completely wrong about this, why the standard interventions fail the majority of people who try them, and what research has consistently shown to be the actual root mechanism driving this kind of vascular and neurological deterioration. By the time we reach the end of this video, you will understand your own body at a level that most people never get from any appointment, any test result, or any prescription pad. So let us start at the beginning. And the beginning is not in your foot. The sensation you feel in your foot is a message that originates much farther up the chain. Your peripheral nerves, the ones that run from your spinal cord down through your legs and into the soles of your feet, are extraordinarily sensitive to oxygen levels in the surrounding tissue. When blood flow is compromised, even subtly, even in ways that do not yet show up dramatically on a standard test, those nerves begin to misfire. They send signals that the brain interprets as tingling, burning, numbness, or a crawling sensation. This is the peripheral nervous system doing exactly what it is designed to do, alerting you to a supply problem. Now, the supply problem. The arteries that feed the lower limbs are among the first to show the effects of what researchers describe as endothelial dysfunction, a breakdown in the inner lining of the blood vessel wall. The endothelium is not just a passive tube, it is a living, biochemically active layer that regulates blood flow, prevents clotting, controls inflammation, and keeps the vessel wall flexible. When the endothelium is healthy, it releases compounds that relax the vessel and keep blood moving smoothly. When it is damaged, the entire system begins to fail from the inside out. And here's the part that most people are never told. The damage to the endothelium does not begin when your cholesterol numbers come back elevated. It does not begin when a doctor notices something on a scan. It begins at the cellular level, years or decades earlier, driven by a process that science has long established as a primary engine of systemic disease: chronic low-grade cellular inflammation. This is not the inflammation you feel when you twist an ankle. That is acute inflammation, a short-term, localized, purposeful response. What I am describing is something far more insidious. It is a background state of cellular distress, invisible on most standard panels, that slowly degrades tissue, accelerates arterial plaque formation, and progressively narrows the space inside your blood vessels. Research has consistently shown that individuals with this kind of chronic subclinical inflammation experience endothelial damage at a rate that outpaces any visible metabolic marker by years. Think about what that means. By the time a scan shows significant arterial narrowing, what some frameworks describe as arteries that are 50, 60, or 80% blocked, the underlying cellular environment that created that blockage has been actively deteriorating for a very long time. The tingling in your foot is not an early warning. It is a late warning dressed up to look like a minor inconvenience. Let me walk you through the actual progression, because understanding this sequence changes everything about how you respond to it. It begins with what researchers call the accumulation of senescent cells, sometimes informally called zombie cells. These are cells that have stopped functioning normally, that can no longer divide or repair themselves, but that refuse to die. A healthy body has mechanisms to clear these cells efficiently, but under conditions of persistent inflammation, oxidative stress, poor sleep, and the kind of metabolic dysfunction that comes from years of processed food consumption and sedentary patterns, those clearance mechanisms break down. Zombie cells do not just sit quietly, they release a cascade of inflammatory compounds into the surrounding tissue. Science has long established that this secretory behavior from senescent cells is one of the most potent drivers of accelerated tissue aging, arterial stiffening, and immune dysregulation. In the arterial wall, these compounds trigger an immune response that causes white blood cells to migrate into the vessel lining, where they begin engulfing oxidized fats and transforming into what are known as foam cells, the primary cellular component of arterial plaque. This is the mechanism. This is why the arteries narrow, not because of fat in your diet, not because of a single biomarker, but because of a cellular environment so overwhelmed with inflammatory debris that the body's repair systems have been redirected into a constant, failing damage control effort. Now I want to pause here and ask you something directly. Have you ever had a doctor explain any of this to you during a standard appointment? Have you ever sat in an office and had someone walk you through what is actually happening at the cellular level when that tingling starts? Leave a comment below and tell me, because from everything I have seen in reviewing patient experiences and clinical literature, the answer for the vast majority of people is no. And that gap in communication is costing people years of their lives. Let me continue, because there is more to this picture that you need to understand. The peripheral nervous system damage I mentioned earlier is not only driven by reduced blood flow, there is a second mechanism, and it runs parallel to the arterial narrowing. When the cellular environment is chronically inflamed, the myelin sheath, the protective coating around your peripheral nerves, becomes vulnerable. Myelin is composed largely of fatty acids and specialized proteins that require a very specific biochemical environment to remain intact. Chronic inflammation disrupts that environment directly. The sheath thins, the nerve signal becomes erratic. The tingling you feel at night is partially vascular, partially structural. Two failing systems expressing themselves through the same symptom. This is why so many people who are told they have peripheral neuropathy and given a B12 supplement see little to no improvement. They are addressing the symptom from one angle, while the underlying driver, that relentless cellular inflammation, continues unchallenged. The nerve cannot heal in an environment that is actively degrading it. You are pouring water into a bucket with a hole in the bottom. There's another symptom pattern I want to address because it almost always accompanies the nighttime tingling and yet almost never gets connected to it in a clinical conversation. Cold feet and hands, not just occasional chilliness, but a persistent, sometimes painful inability to warm the extremities, especially in temperatures that other people find comfortable. This is a direct expression of reduced peripheral perfusion, meaning the microvascular network in the fingers and toes is not delivering adequate blood volume to the tissue. The same endothelial dysfunction driving your arterial narrowing is simultaneously compromising your capillary beds. Then there is the fatigue pattern. I have reviewed accounts from individuals dealing with this kind of vascular deterioration, and the fatigue they describe is distinctive. It is not tiredness that comes from poor sleep, though the sleep disruption from nighttime symptoms contributes. It is a heaviness, a cellular exhaustion that makes previously simple physical activities feel disproportionately difficult. This is the tissue speaking. When cells are not receiving adequate oxygen delivery and are simultaneously producing high volumes of inflammatory byproduct, energy production at the mitochondrial level collapses. The body slows down not because it is lazy, but because it is conserving a resource that is genuinely becoming scarce. Cramping in the calves during walking, a condition that the medical literature describes as claudication, is another expression of this same process. The muscle demands more oxygen during activity than the narrowed artery can supply. The result is pain that forces a stop. Many people describe this as knee trouble, as muscle weakness, as getting older. It is none of those things. It is an arterial delivery failure showing up in the tissue it is supposed to feed. I want to take a moment here before we go further because I'm going to share something later in this video that connects every one of these symptoms, the tingling, the cold extremities, the fatigue, the cramping, to a single biological root. And more importantly, I'm going to explain the specific mechanism through which that root can be addressed in a way that most approaches never even attempt. Stay with me, because what comes next is the piece that most people spend years looking for without ever finding it. Let us talk about what the standard medical response to these symptoms typically looks like, because it matters. The most common pathway goes something like this. You report the tingling, you get blood work ordered, perhaps your fasting glucose is elevated, or your A1C is in the pre-diabetic or diabetic range, and suddenly the tingling is filed under diabetic neuropathy. You are given medication to manage the blood sugar number, perhaps a statin for the cholesterol, perhaps a calcium channel blocker for blood pressure. Each drug targets a downstream marker. None of them touch the cellular inflammation engine. Research has consistently shown that individuals on long-term statin therapy, while seeing reductions in LDL cholesterol on paper, often experience continued progression of arterial calcification and endothelial dysfunction. The number improves. The process continues, because the number was never the cause. The number is the smoke. The fire is somewhere deeper in the metabolic and cellular environment where the real decisions are being made. The same applies to the standard dietary guidance. Reduce saturated fat, eat more whole grains. The framework is based on a model of cardiovascular disease that is, at this point, significantly outdated relative to what the cellular biology literature has established. An individual can follow that guidance perfectly and still see arterial progression because the guidance does not address the senescent cell burden, does not address the inflammatory signaling cascade, does not address the fundamental question of whether the body's own cellular cleanup mechanisms are functioning. And this is exactly where a concept that has received extraordinary attention in the cellular biology research space becomes critical to understand. That concept is autophagy. Autophagy is a biological survival mechanism, one of the most sophisticated and important processes the human body possesses. The word itself means self-eating, and that is precisely what happens. When autophagy is activated properly, the body enters a state that I can only describe as a cellular reckoning. Internal cleanup machinery, structures called autophagosomes, move through the cell, identifying damaged organelles, dysfunctional proteins, oxidized fatty acids, and yes, those zombie cells I described earlier, and breaking them down for recycling. The cellular environment clears, inflammation drops, the endothelium begins to repair, nerve tissue can begin the slow process of recovery. The scientific community has established that autophagy is not a fringe concept or an emerging hypothesis. It is a fundamental biological process that earned a Nobel Prize in medicine and has been the subject of thousands of research papers establishing its role in aging, cardiovascular function, neurological integrity, and metabolic health. The problem, and this is the critical piece, is that modern life almost perfectly suppresses autophagy. Chronic high food intake, particularly of processed and refined carbohydrates, keeps insulin elevated, and elevated insulin is one of the most potent known inhibitors of autophagic activity. The body never enters the cellular cleaning state because the metabolic signals that trigger it are continuously overridden by the modern eating pattern. What research has consistently shown is that specific inputs, particular compounds found in common foods, consumed at specific times and in specific combinations, can reactivate autophagic signaling even in a metabolic environment that has been suppressed for years. The body still knows how to run this process. It has not forgotten. It simply has not been given the biological permission. This is the foundation of what I found when I went deep into the literature surrounding cellular inflammation and arterial health. A protocol built around 4 specific morning activators, all of them available in any ordinary kitchen, that work synergistically to shift the body's internal chemistry into an autophagic state within hours of consumption. Not a pharmaceutical intervention, not a surgical procedure, a precisely sequenced biological trigger. What I want to share with you now, and I want to be direct about why I am sharing this because it matters, is something called the Cellular Hunger Protocol. The name is precise. This is not about starving yourself. This is about triggering a state of cellular hunger, a deliberate, controlled activation of the body's own internal scavenging system so that it begins doing what it was always designed to do, but has been prevented from doing by the metabolic conditions of modern life. The Cellular Hunger Protocol works through 4 morning activators. These are not exotic substances. They are compounds with well-documented biological effects combined in a sequence and proportion that creates a synergistic autophagic trigger that none of them would produce individually. Within the first days of the protocol, what the research framework behind it describes is a shift in cellular signaling, a drop in the inflammatory compounds produced by senescent cells, an increase in autophagic flux, and the beginning of a process where the body is literally consuming the cellular debris that has been accumulating for years. Over a 30-day cycle, this creates conditions where the arterial... I want you to think for a moment about someone in your life. Maybe it is you, maybe it is someone you love, who has been living with these symptoms for years. The nighttime tingling, the morning stiffness, the legs that ache after a short walk, the hands that never seem to warm up, the exhaustion that sleep does not fix. That person has been doing everything they were told to do, taking the pills, watching the diet, going to the appointments, and the slow deterioration has continued anyway. What they were never given was this conversation. They were never told about the cellular layer. They were never introduced to the biology of zombie cells, of autophagic suppression, of what is actually driving the process that their symptoms are expressing. That gap is not their fault. It is a systemic failure in how health information reaches people who need it most. What I can tell you, based on everything I have reviewed in the clinical and cellular biology literature, is that there is a pathway. That pathway does not require a prescription. It does not require an expensive procedure. It requires understanding what is happening at the cellular level and then providing the specific biological inputs that allow the body to begin correcting it. The Cellular Hunger Protocol represents the most comprehensive, research-aligned application of autophagic science I have found for exactly this population. Individuals dealing with the symptoms of chronic vascular and neurological inflammation who have exhausted the standard options without resolution. Before I tell you where to find it, I want to ask you one more thing. How long have you been living with these symptoms and telling yourself it was probably nothing? How many times have you pushed it to the back of your mind because the appointment said everything looked fine, Drop that number in the comments, even just a rough answer, because if what I described today matches what you have been experiencing, you are not alone and you're not imagining it. The individuals who have worked through this protocol consistently describe a trajectory that begins in the first week with changes in morning energy and sleep quality, often the first. Indication that the inflammatory burden is beginning to shift and progresses over the full 30 days into measurable differences in the symptoms that brought them to this research in the first place. The tingling reduces, the cold extremities warm, the calf cramping becomes less frequent, the fatigue that has become normalized begins to lift in a way that feels, for many people, like remembering a version of themselves they thought was gone. This is not magic. This is cellular biology functioning as it was designed to function. The mechanism is real, it is documented, and it is accessible. Now I need to be honest with you about one thing. The cellular hunger protocol is not something I can guarantee will be available at open access indefinitely. The depth of support, the ongoing refinement of the protocol based on emerging research, and the individualized application guidance that comes with it require a level of curation that limits how many new people can be brought in at any given time. I've seen these doors close before when the capacity is reached, sometimes for weeks. If this conversation has resonated with you today, if you recognize yourself in what I described, I genuinely cannot promise that waiting until tomorrow means the same access will be there. The link you need is in the pinned comment directly below this video. That is the only place I share it because it is the only place I can ensure it reaches the right people, the ones who made it to the end of this conversation, who took the time to understand what is actually happening in their bodies, and who are ready to give their cells what they have been waiting years to receive. Go to the pinned comment now. What you find there could be the most important click you make today.